Hello, everyone, and welcome to our book launch this afternoon. Thank you for being here. It's lovely to see you in this virtual realm. I'll just let you know we are recording this afternoon's main part of the event, which we may upload later for a record of the conversation that we're going to have together. Let me begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land that the University of Melbourne occupies, and where I, like many of us, live and work. This land, let's remember, in these times when invading forces, I guess, are foremost in all of our minds, this land was never ceded. And this land where we live and work was and is and always will be Aboriginal land. I pay my respects to the Wurundjeri elders, past and present, and to any other First Nations people who are attending this event today. What we're going to do this afternoon is, in a moment, I'm going to turn over to Professor Tejaswini Niranjana, who I'm really honoured to welcome as the launcher of the book today. Professor Niranjana is one of those people who, of course, we always say, a bit of a cliche, needs no introduction. She is her most recent projects, in a stellar career of engaging with cultural studies work in trans-Asian, inter-Asian contexts. Her most recent post is to head up the Centre for Inter-Asian Research at Ahmedabad University in India, from where Professor Niranjana joins us today. And I'm so pleased to have her here, of course. And she graciously offered to launch the book. So I'll hand over to Professor Niranjana in a moment to perhaps say a few words. We'll then have a conversation between the two of us. And after that, I want to let you all know up front, we want to have a Q&A or a discussion or a conversation section after Professor Niranjana and I finish our conversation. So we really welcome questions, comments, remarks, critiques, whatever you would like to do. But right now, I'm going to hand over to Teju. Thank you, Teju, please.
Yes, so Fran, lovely to see you, albeit virtually. It's been 2 years for all of us, right, to not be able to meet. But I hope we can soon do something about that. It's also a cliche to say I have known Fran forever, but it does feel like I have. I remember, I think, that I met you in Taiwan, and your first book was either in the making or had just come out, Backward Glances. And when I did meet you in Melbourne shortly thereafter, you had given me a copy of the book, which I really treasure. There's a book which those of you who don't know about Chinese female homoeroticism, and you can see from the title that the ambivalence about selfhood and modernity that Fran tracks in her latest book is also something that she's been thinking about for a very long time. And that first book also, I think, shows some evidence of this preoccupation. Of course, I know Fran from her many interventions and essays and public presence in the Inter-Asia Cultural Studies Circuit and elsewhere. But also, I think, as more recently, the co-author of the book Telemodernities, again, a path-breaking work in trying to do comparative work across Asia, comparative research, and to do it in an ethnographic mode, which I think that's her strongest research method. That and the preoccupation with modernity and selfhood is some ways that she's going to be addressing in this current work as well. She just reminded me that she has many more books to her credit than I'd imagined, and the book that she's actually mentioned was about situating sexualities. Apologies, but there's one more notch on that amazing record of publication. So I was so delighted when I heard this book was coming out. She will be speaking a little bit, telling you what the book is doing, and then we'll have this conversation. I hope that the kind of questions you'll hear us grappling with together will really give you a very good glimpse of where the book is going and what it covers. And I hope it will make you go out and order that book, or go out into the real world and buy a book from your nearest bookstore. Um, so, Fran, would you like to say something about why you wrote this book? Just a few minutes, and then we will talk about the book itself.
Sure. Thank you, Teju. And I didn't mean to claim to have written extra books. So sorry about that. Yeah, why did I write this book? I feel that this book was really a long time in the making before I actually did the research that ended up becoming the book. I think it was in the making before I was even consciously aware that it was something that I might do, in the sense that, I mean, I guess teaching in the Australian university system since around about the year 2000, or even actually a bit before that, has been a process of watching an increasingly large wave of young students, and particularly women students in the arts faculty where I teach, make their way from China to Australia for tertiary education, to study with us in our universities. And I found this, I was always wondering what their experience was like. And that thought was triggered in my mind partly by my own experience as a young student, actually younger than many of them. I spent some years in mainland China and in Taiwan as a student as well myself. So I knew how life-changing it can be. And I wondered what it would be like for this current generation of young women who come and study with us. And I wondered not only, I knew what it was broadly like for them in the classroom. I could see the work they were producing for us. But I wondered what it was like subjectively, and it made me curious to know, essentially. Even some of the projects we did in class, sometimes in like first year cultural studies, we used to have students do a project where they wrote critically about their own living space, like whether that was a shared house or a bedroom or something. And some of the international students from China would write about that topic in ways that were quite evocative and quite like affectively really rich, filled with, I guess, homesickness and various other emotions about what it felt like to live in Melbourne. So I then sort of took the opportunity to think, well, this could be a fundable research project, and managed, thank goodness and thanks to the Australian Research Council, to get some really decent funding to do a fellowship project on this topic, and to dedicate really 5 years of my life full-time without teaching, an immense luxury, to working with this group of 56 young women from China and really getting to know them, and doing this as an ethnographic project. And hence that's what the book is, really about that experience for them and for me.
So, shall we jump straight into the questions?
Sure.
So let me begin with the first one. Your book, Dreams of Flight, and I'm thinking of dreams as both a verb and a noun here, so that's quite interesting to think about it in that way. It's basically about transnational mobility of young Chinese women in a time of global capitalism. So your main interest is in the forms of subjectivity and in gendering processes that the women are shaping as they move to Australia to study. So immersed in this world, the social world of capitalist late modernity, as you put it, young trans migrants are seeking to bridge their past and future lives through higher education in a Western country. So, what, according to you, is the most striking feature of this transnational mobility, of this study abroad fever? Is it the volume of traffic? Is it the nature of the participants, or something else?
Thanks, Teju. I think really the most striking features are all of the above. You mentioned 3 possibilities. I think it's all of them. The volume of the traffic is absolutely staggering. Like, we've kind of have got used to it in a sense, because there are so many Chinese young people going out pre-COVID, and now again sort of semi-post-COVID, to a lot of countries in the West. So we've become used to it, but it's sort of an amazing number. Over 700,000 such students left China to study abroad in 2019. So the last year we have the pre-COVID figures for. But the nature of the participants in this transnational traffic is also interesting to me, in the sense, well, they have particular characteristics. They're by no means representative of typical women in China. They're overwhelmingly young. My sample group was born broadly in the generation that we call the post-90s generation, so born around 1990 or after. So they're young, middle class. They're part of that vast and fragmented and internally contradictory and complex class formation we call the Chinese middle classes, plural. They're urban, they're from urban areas, and they're well-resourced. Obviously, they're mainly now financed by their families, unlike earlier waves of Chinese students abroad who tended to be scholarship students. And they're studying different kinds of things, overwhelmingly in the areas of business, finance, economics, commerce, and so on. And there are 60% young women coming out of China, which is interesting, because if we look at the birth cohorts, of the gender ratio of this birth cohort, there's more men than women born in these years, but 60% of the people going out, according to the Chinese government's own figures, are female. So that's, in other words, they're more likely to go abroad for study than their male peers. But really the most striking feature of this mobility, and I don't want to preempt our later conversation, but just to give a flag, is really what the book is most centrally concerned to illustrate. And that is the capacity of this form of education mobility to fundamentally transform subjectivities, to transform how people understand themselves and their place in the world, to rewrite these young women's sense of themselves as gendered subjects, and to reroute their life plans in sometimes quite radical ways. So at the broadest possible level, I now realize, having written the book and kind of come to the end of that project, this has turned out to be a book about the production of subjects for transnational capitalism. So not all of my research participants were studying in the finance field, but a majority were. Some of them were studying in other kinds of areas, from a few in the arts and media studies and so on, through to a couple in the sciences. But nonetheless, almost all of them underwent a similar kind of subjective transformation, which aligns with this notion of producing subjects for global capitalism. So I'm interested in thinking, how does this economic system that we all inhabit make its subjects? That is, those people who make its systems run in the future and who are in themselves partly shaped in the image of that economic system. So what's most striking in terms of the book's main findings is the extent to which the process of making what we might call, to use an overused word, neoliberal subjects, that is, young women in this case who are self-reliant, they see themselves as flexible, and they have the dream of individual competitive advancement gleaming in their eyes, at least some of the time. Making these subjects entails a parallel process of gendered individualization and detraditionalization. So I just think the gendered effects of that subject making are fascinating. This is in a context where the Chinese state and commercial popular media and popular cultures have been pushing a neo-traditionalist line on women's identity and social role, which I'll talk a bit more about later. But I basically find in the book that one of the most remarkable things about this educational flow is the way that transnational education seemed to advance women's disembedding from national systems of gender ideology, right on the China side, and to advance their re-embedding into a more transnational system of what we might very loosely call neoliberal ideology. But I'm probably getting ahead of myself. I'll stop there.
Okay, so why don't we then jump to a methodology question? Will allow you to say something about how you actually approached your topic. Say something about the ethnographic depth of your project. I was actually quite stunned at the number of times you've met the participants in your study, both in Australia and in China. So something about that, the feel of that. And could you also comment on how you crafted this project through the ethnographic methodology? Why would you investigate the phenomenon of higher education migration through an ethnography of the trans migrants rather than through a quantitative study of their movements, which is more usual in, say, higher education research? So, basically, tell us more about your interest in understanding how mobility feels.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a great question because it actually connects to a much broader issue for me, which has become sharpened and refined through the process of researching and writing this book. That is, I think, those around me might know, for many years now, I've been in the grips of this tension between the qualitative and, obviously human focused methods of the humanities where I was trained and the allure of alternative approaches in a more social science tradition that emphasize scientific style methods like quantitative studies and sort of harder, more scientific so-called proof of arguments, alongside macro scale theories that attempt to account for massive swathes of social life in a highly generalized and abstracted sense based on those big data. So I'm really kind of attracted to both of those methods at different times in almost like a love-hate kind of way over the years. Now, this project, though, ultimately has really renewed my faith in qualitative methods, I think, and a humanities style approach to people's social and cultural experiences. There are many, as you rightly say, there are many quantitative studies already available about international student experience. For example, based on surveys, tick the box type things, thousands of students answering a series of standardized questions about push-pull factors, about which country is more attractive to them and why. But what's relatively lacking in this field are not completely lacking, but relatively lacking are in-depth qualitative studies of what education mobility means and how it feels from that individual subjective perspective that you're underlining there. But I do hasten to add, there are some really exceptional existing studies that manage this really well, especially works by Vanessa Fong, Annie Kajanis, and Una Kim, but also many other, interestingly, often women and feminist researchers in the field. But for me, that question that you've put your finger on there, that question about how a given social phenomenon or process feels subjectively for those in its midst, whether it's education, mobility, or anything else, that really is the most fascinating and important question there is, just from my personal kind of perspective or bias, I guess. Because I kind of feel if we don't know how a specific social or cultural process feels for the people who are part of that process, how can we possibly claim to know what that process will mean, right? Or where its wider significance will lie. I mean, if we're interested in the human side of cultural life and we're wondering what that means, we just have to know how people feel about things, right? So this is one of the most difficult questions, though, to research. And there's clearly a need to move beyond the classical humanities methods of representational analysis, I think, and to include some human research. I think there is. I mean, this is where cultural studies led me, right? From thinking about texts to thinking about the audiences or the readerships of those texts to thinking about ethnography. So it's become more and more human focused. But that human research ideally needs to be in-depth, qualitative, and longitudinal to attend to the ineffable aspects like affect, the individual's singularity, and embodied and subjective experience. Those are quite difficult for the researcher to access, and to do so requires the investment of really quite considerable resources and quite considerable time. So hence my eternal gratitude to the Australian Research Council for providing those resources to make a study like this possible. As you said, Teju, this really was quite life-making, this study, not only for me, but for my whole family and many people around me for the years of the study. We really did hang out a lot with the participants, saw them multiple times, became part of their lives and vice versa. The young women were coming to our house on Christmas Eve, or we were taking them out to the mountains to go hiking and going to hometowns in China, meeting people's families. it was very personally transformative, I guess, for me. As I think they're telling me also for them those years of their life are kind of memorable in that way. So it's really got that kind of human personal connection, which is both just enriching in itself, but I think really allows us to get at some of those affective aspects quite effectively in the way that other methods wouldn't have allowed.
Let me ask you now about how you're thinking about, say, gendered self-fashioning in this project. You've touched upon it, but if you could say more about how higher education mobility in your project gets entangled with this gendered self-fashioning. You flagged the idea of neo-traditional gender roles as they're sort of becoming more prominent in China. So, what are the kinds of contradictions, gendered contradictions, to do with these neo-traditional gender roles and the striving selfhood, as you call it, that they're trying to fashion for themselves? So basically, how does gender shape mobility and how does mobility shape gender, as I understand is your preoccupation? Can you tell us how the young women negotiate these contradictions, whether it's in the realm of sexuality or that of religious belief? Because your book really covers a vast spectrum of questions.
Okay, yeah, great. I love speaking about this part. I guess this really is getting back to the study's main findings. I did briefly touch on them a moment ago, but to recap and elaborate a bit on that with specific examples from the chapters, the main finding really is that studying abroad impacts on graduates' understandings of their own gendered identity. So broadly speaking, I found that overseas study tended to decrease graduates' identification with that neo-traditionalist understanding of adult women's family-focused identity. And this kind of idea that an adult woman would define her life and herself and her worth mainly through family care work as a central pillar, and a career, if there is one, could add on to that maybe, but the central thing should be family. This is promulgated by the post-socialist state in China. So often I think people tend to, people in the midst of these pressures themselves think, well, these pressures are hundreds or thousands of years old. It's traditional Chinese culture. And to an extent, of course, that's true. But to another extent, in a different way, this is something that has been re-emphasized in a new way after the end of high socialism. So it very much is a post-socialist picture of gendered retraditionalization. This identification with that tends to decrease generally in my group after studying in Australia. What increased correspondingly was their identification with a much more individualized in the sociological sense of a life of one's own rather than living for others in the case of women. A more self-focused identity, more autonomous, more self-reliant, more consumerist in a different kind of way, and a more professionally oriented form of identity. So some would call this a turn toward a type of hypermobile, neoliberal identity, a self-understanding that arguably fits the graduates into the corporate labour force demands of transnational capitalism. And I guess that's kind of what I think we're doing for them. Along these lines, I call that type of identity to which they became increasingly attached mobile enterprising selfhood. So to answer your question, in the realm of sexuality specifically, I found that while overseas, the students experienced a kind of what I've called a partial suspension of some of the sex gender norms of home. This is due largely to distance from surveillance by the elder generation, a sort of psychological sense that even though your mum and dad or auntie or whoever can ring you every day or speak to you on WeChat every day, they're not here. They're not about to leap out at you and judge what you're doing in quite such an immediate way. And that to some extent, as a result of that, they were able to elaborate alternative norms around relationships and sexuality, which one might broadly say were more sort of progressive or liberal. For example, they found increased opportunities in Australia to explore non-conventional intimate relationships, including same-sex relationships in some cases, non-committed sexual relationships, non-married living together with partners, right? And relationships in some cases, even marriage and children with partners of whom their parents explicitly disapproved for whatever reason, whether because the boyfriend didn't have enough money, or because he was the wrong ethnicity, or, you know, whatever. There's all kinds of reasons for parents to disapprove, as we know. So there's a kind of suspension of some of this. However, the sex gender norms of home never completely disappeared, but they kind of followed the mobile women, so that they had to constantly negotiate between divergent sex gender value systems. An example of that would be the stubborn stigma attaching to certain sexual behaviours, including women's sexual adventurousness, in their peer groups, both at home and abroad. So even though, this is why I say partial suspension, right? So it's like the norms are partially suspended, but they haven't completely gone away. Now the question, obviously the kind of emotional toll of mediating between different sexual or sex gender value systems is large. This is another major finding, that performing this kind of work of mediating between different systems of value is exhausting and difficult, and it's a really intense form of emotional labour. The question of how this plays out in religious practice while students are in Australia is maybe a bit more complex. And by the way, can I just flag that the religion chapter, which is chapter 6 in the book, is I think my favourite chapter of the book because of the complexity of the material, the centrality of affective experience, the links into multiple points that are both intellectual and policy related. I really kind of like this chapter. Essentially, my core participant group was not very religious. There were 3 women in that group who continued to sort of lightly observe religious faiths connected to their family backgrounds. One was Catholic, one was Muslim, and one was Buddhist. But 2 other participants took on new faiths while they were in Australia. One in the Church of the Latter-day Saints, which is the Mormon church, and one in a Pentecostal megachurch, the Planet Shakers. In both of those cases, there were 2 sets of gendered elements to their participation. First was what I saw as their gendered vulnerabilities. The 2 young women who got heavily involved with these churches were, in my view, particularly needing greater emotional support than universities or other agencies were able to provide for them. And so they were particularly, I guess, ready to see the advances of evangelical churches, like both of these are. Both were working out their personal orientations to big gendered life questions, including intimate relationships, sexuality, marriage, and in one case, unplanned pregnancy. So they were really needing that support. Second, the teachings of the 2 churches in question attempted to affect another kind of gendered retraditionalization. The Mormon church models and promotes a deeply conservative positions on gender identity, heterosexuality, and marriage. It speaks to all young women as future mothers, for example, exalts feminine modesty, sexual abstinence, and early marriage. The Pentecostal megachurches like Planet Shakers and Hillsong here in Australia actively promote heteronormativity, sexual abstinence outside marriage, which is symbolically compensated by the sexualization of the believer's relationship with God. As anyone will know who's been to one of these services, it's very intense. And they have a flagrantly sexist doctrine of submissive wives supporting men's family and church headship. Headship, it's a word I think they invented. So I make the argument that Australia's notionally secular state effectively outsources international students' welfare service to religious organisations, and that's what we saw in the 2 cases that I wrote about. This is alongside its similar outsourcing of a wide range of other welfare and education services, as Marianne Maddox has demonstrated in depth in a number of her books. This is an issue in broader Australian public life. So in this situation, I just found it particularly disquieting that those with the most reactionary teachings on gender and sexuality, anti-feminist, gender essentialist, often homophobic, seem to be the most successful in reaching these students.
So, to move on to another aspect of your book, um, could you speak about the lived experience of what you call flexible residence? I'm referring here to the role of social media, communicative apps. You've already mentioned WeChat and the connection to the family, even if they're in Australia. But the point that I find extremely interesting is that for you, translocality doesn't mean that the students are floating, because you stress the importance of geographic placement in both China and Australia at the same time. You also stress the idea of singularity in talking about subject formation. So, is there some way in which these ideas are connected? The idea of geographic placement and the idea of singularity?
Interestingly, I hadn't thought about this until I, you told me your question, or you asked me your question. I do think they're connected in a way, when I think about it, in that both of these ideas foreground the need to attend closely to the materiality of people's embodied experience. That's really what they're both about, both of those arguments, that one isn't sucked out of geographic locality by social media, and that we must take seriously the singularity of individual experience. I guess in studies of global processes generally, and especially in some forms of new media studies, there tends to be an assumption that locality and geographic place have ceased to matter. We hear about time-space compression, we hear about the flows of digital information across territorial boundaries, etc. But I was keen from the beginning, I guess, to take a more grounded approach. I was already suspicious of those kinds of generalizations, because after all, even when immersed momentarily in our screens, we're always somewhere, right? There's always something physical going on, even when we're sucked into our phone screen. And I found that the students' experiences of the city of Melbourne specifically, while highly mediated, were nevertheless, of course, they couldn't be entirely mediated, right? There's always a bodily reality of being here. If you're scrolling your phone on a suburban train, you're still on the suburban train. And if a fight breaks out over here, you're going to be sucked right out of your screen again and be part of that scene. There's all kinds of ways in which one is physically present in the city, especially when you're the target of a racist assault, when you're eating, sleeping, working. All of these things are not directly mediated all of the time. So I guess I'm arguing that the experience of place becomes a hybrid one. It weaves together bits and pieces of digital and physical experiences. And this hybridity is what makes the city. Now, the notion of singularity, which I borrowed from Dipesh Chakrabarty, who borrowed it from Paul Vane, I think, refers to those irreducible elements of subjective and affective experience. So singularity in this sense doesn't stand in opposition to shared cultural practices, but instead it designates a kind of ineffable kernel of subjective experience, whether individual or collective, which resists capture by the generalizing abstractions of theory. Nor does singularity simply mean particularity or specificity. As Chakrabarty reminds us helpfully, the very notion of the specific belongs to a structure, the structure of a general, that necessarily occludes our view of the singular. Singularity, I'm still quoting Chakrabarty, singularity comes into being when we look on things in such a way not to see them as particular expressions of what is general. So this too is about taking seriously the actual there-ness of embodied experience, like of the self, right, as much as of locality. And I think the importance and difficulty of doing this were brought home to me really strongly through this project. And since this is quite an important part of what came out of the project for me, I'd like to, if it's not too self-absorbed, I want to read a short passage where I try to summarize some of how I feel about this from the book's conclusion. It's not that long. I really want to read this, so I will. So I say here that by starting inductively from participants' subjective and affective experiences and trying to remain alive to the fickle interactions among the plural frameworks they drew on in making sense of these, making meaning from these, I hope to have avoided the determinism of an approach that would privilege any single preconceived symbolic structure, rather than interpret affective life as merely an epiphenomenon of social theory's bloodless categories. This study has wanted to remain open to ethnography's capacity to challenge pre-formulated understandings about what selfhood or gender, class, place, sexuality, race, religion, work, nation, or any other aspect of social life will actually mean for people in practice. Neoliberalism, individualization, capitals, networks, globalization, a darkened room, a snatch of melody, the taste of a loquat, an emoji, a tear wiped away. How do these two sets of terms relate? What mediates between them? And how shall we make sense of it? Are the latter merely trivial traces that ultimately point through some shadowy logic toward the big picture contexts referenced in the masterful languages of the former? Or could the second group of terms instead challenge the very basis of the former's totalizing claims to comprehend social reality through theoretical abstraction? This book's project has been split by a tension between the analytic imperative to translate people's experiences into abstract contentions about macro-scale patterns and ethnography's tendency to undercut such structures of generality by foregrounding the irreducible singularities of subjective and intersubjective experience at the phenomenological level. So yeah, I mean, that's the tension that is most meaningful for me coming out of the work as a whole.
Thanks, Fran. That was really, I think, well placed. The reading from the book as well. Um, to now move to another aspect of your book that I find very fascinating, which is much more generally about how you see China in the light of these transmigrants. You talk about the centrality of the dream trope in China, and your book is called Dreams of Flight. So, what's the significance of this dream trope in this era of late capitalism?
Yeah, thanks. This is a trope which I kind of thought of as a title. And then next time I was visiting China after that, it really struck me how central this notion of the dream or the 梦想 is to everyday life. Like you walk through a railway station, there's ads, on billboards, those electronic billboards saying you must pursue your dream of owning a luxury vehicle or maybe like traveling the world or something. Political discourse, as we all know, in under President Xi Jinping, there's this notion of the China dream, 中国梦, was the same term or a closely related term. It's right throughout commercial, popular, everyday and state political cultures, this notion that we must have something that we're striving for single-mindedly, passionately, and in a kind of all-absorbing kind of way. So what does this dream trope do? It centers the individualized, desiring and striving subject who has been constructed as the hero and the heroine to some extent of the post-socialist era. This is kind of still a collective subject in the political sense of the China dream. That is a collective project, but it is also, it gains its power by linking that collective aspiration to the individual desiring self. Lisa Rofel, and among others, has written, groundbreakingly about this several years ago now. The goal-directed dreamer then is autonomous, is self-reliant. She asks for no support from the state, but is striving to make it alone. And this is deeply interiorized at the subjective level. This is some of the main ideological work done by the dream concept. It entails deep psychologized subjective identification with the rightness of the desiring, independent, self-reliant, post-socialist subject model. So in a sense, this vision of the dream trope represents the Chinese post-socialist variant of global neoliberal subjecthood, if you like to make a sort of slightly crude analogy, but I think there's some relation there for sure. Seeing ourselves as self-directed dreamers, after all, places responsibility for our success or failure in the competitive environment of late capitalist societies and markets squarely back onto ourselves. Attention is thus directed away from structural inequalities. So that's one key meaning of the dream in the book's title, in the sense that transnational education is part of the dream of competitive self-advancement. I dream of getting a PhD, being a CEO, traveling the world, it's that desiring self. But the other almost opposite meaning of the dream in the title, as I intend it, refers to that subjective and affective excess or remainder from this process, right, which I discussed a moment ago. All of those ineffable, internal, unrepeatable specificities of individual subjective experience, right? Daydreams, half understood longings, and so on, which are not part of that mainstream or, kind of desiring selfhood, I guess.
I'm sure that what happens, in spite of the dream that propelled the migration, that when students actually arrive in Melbourne, they probably face things that they hadn't quite expected. For example, racism. Yes, of course, maybe they hear on WeChat or in their circuits that, they might encounter such sort of hostile feelings. But I think what's interesting, and I think some questions are already coming up in the chat box about the class positioning of the students. So, in a sense, these students are non-white in a predominantly white society, but they're upwardly mobile at the same time. Yes? So, what contradictions in the social positioning do they face in Australia? So, how do they deal with racism? How do they deal with these contradictions? How, for example, do they deal with the Chinese micro world they often find themselves in? I mean, they come straight from, a small town in China into Chinatown in Melbourne. Then what kind of work do they find for their part-time, earnings? What about their experience of work? What about the gendered nature of that work? This is a central part of your book, so I would like you to spend a little time elaborating these.
Sure thing. I'd love to. Yeah, I do argue that the students are positioned paradoxically vis-a-vis class and race in their educational sojourns in Western countries like Australia. While overseas study is intended to help them, I would say it's not so much about upward mobility, it's about maintaining middle class status, sometimes improving status, but often about maintaining that status in China. So that's the plan. But in Melbourne, when they arrive, they risk becoming what has been called downwardly global when corralled into precarious work at the bottom end of the labour market. In pre-departure interviews with study participants in China, most spoke about their plans to find work in what they called local or dangdi, implying non-Chinese run businesses in Melbourne, in the area of their major. So they wanted to get professional work experience. They hoped that would provide a means of forging local friendships, of advancing their career, and so on. And this is one of the things I hasten to note, that we sell our degrees overseas based on the promise that when you graduate, you'll get a working rights for 18 months to 2 years usually. So it's really a big sell. So you're meant to be able to get Western, professional experience. But after arriving in Melbourne, participants generally found that the types of professional work experience they hoped for were mainly out of their reach because, one, anti-Chinese racism in Australian employment markets. This has been shown in statistical studies. Having a Chinese sounding name means you get less callbacks. Secondly, exclusion based on visa status. So that temporary graduate visa I mentioned, in fact, in a cruel irony, excludes graduates from consideration by many employers. The big banks, the big four accounting firms seem to feel no compunction in saying, oh, you're on that visa, well, you can't apply for an internship even, let alone a job with us here in the Melbourne office or in the Sydney office. So in employment, as in social life more broadly, students are often thrown back into what I call the expatriate micro world, which is peopled by others who share their own ethnicity and often also their own nationality. E.g., in the realm of employment, relinquishing their earlier hopes to find local work experience relevant to their field of study, many end up working in underpaid jobs in Chinatowns or Chinese-run restaurants and real estate businesses elsewhere in the city, in the central city area. This is bad for a number of reasons. Number one, wage theft and exploitation is endemic in hospitality in general, but particularly in these restaurants where the students were working. They paid significantly less than people were, who were also underpaid were getting paid in other restaurants. It was even worse. Secondly, the lack of a chance for cross-cultural and to cross cultural and linguistic boundaries and to enjoy the type of localized experience they initially hoped to have. Restaurant work is, as we know, highly gendered. So girls or young women are corralled into customer-facing roles, entailing emotional labor in dealing with customers, in dealing with angry bosses, in dealing with displaying their bodies in certain feminized uniforms and so on, while young men are corralled into backroom work in kitchens out of the sort of customer-facing roles. So in this situation, some took up an alternative, a really, really interesting sort of micro-entrepreneurial alternative in e-trading or daigou as a form of, feminine micro-entrepreneurship. This is where the students would buy Australian products, which are in demand in China, particularly infant milk formula and health supplements, also some other things like sheepskin boots and various supermarket items, and sell them to their networks back in China through marketing them on, usually via ads placed on WeChat, and then sending them back through Chinese-run discount courier services. And if you throw yourself into this with massive energy, you can actually make a much better amount of money than you would through the exploitative restaurant work. And I have one participant in particular who was like the Daigou queen. She was amazing. She made quite a bit of money in her first year of doing Daigou, bought a car, and some other things. So this is seen as a significantly feminine pursuit that draws on young women's wide and deep social networks and their communicative and life casting skills. So while men might do Daigou as well, it's generally, I found, seen as a sort of women's thing. In contrast to restaurant work, it's a highly mobile and inherently transnational form of feminized labor. So I kind of argue that the women students who do this type of work tactically use forms of micro level mobility that are available to them. For example, transnational social media, access to courier services, use, knowledge of, expertise in mobile payment systems and so on, to escape exploitation in the more geo-fixed domain of low status hospitality work. So both types of works are highly feminized, but they contrast, I guess, in other kinds of ways.
So to move towards the later part of your book, and to ask you a difficult question about Chinese nationalism amongst trans migrants. This is something that people have noted in different parts of the world, and there is, in some strange way, although there are the nationalism in different places has its own charge depending on which nation you're part of. Chinese nationalism is often frowned upon by certain kinds of places where the trans migrants are going. So what is this about Chinese nationalism that you discuss in your book? How do you distinguish that from patriotism? How do you talk about the situation of the trans migrant and what sense of feeling they might have towards the mother country? So how does the affective politics of national connection while living a trans migrant life play out in the lives of your young women? The homeland as mother, the familial mother, the question of filial piety in China, and also digital youth nationalism, which is a sort of a phenomenon that one encounters in different parts of the world. Could you speak to all of these, please?
Sure. This is indeed a big and timely question. And I mean, just in a nutshell, to summarize what I'm about to say, I really found that the forms of national feeling that I found in my participants were more complex by a quantum measure than anything that's represented in the kind of mainstream media and popular discourse here in Australia, which is extremely, it's become increasingly sort of really paranoid and worried about students as kind of sleeper cells for Chinese nationalism. Over the period I was doing this research, it's just got worse and worse in that regard. So I guess the background to understanding this question of nationalism is twofold. First of all, to say that the generation born in and after the 1990s or 1990 has come of age in a time of contradictory influences. On the one hand, a transnational imaginary is increasingly available to these middle-class urban young women. There's ubiquitous English teaching in the schools they've attended. Transnational entertainment and online media is also ubiquitous. The Great Firewall notwithstanding, they all know how to use a VPN to climb over the wall. And anyway, there's plenty that is not, directly censored entertainment media. The new availability of travel for leisure and of course for education and so on. So it's an increasingly a generation that thinks transnationally almost from the beginning. On the other hand, though, since the early 1990s, the party state has enforced a patriotic education curriculum in the post-1989 era that inculcates Chinese nationalism quite intentionally through a discourse of national humiliation at the hands of the West and Japan. So in considering participants' national feeling while abroad, I was actively having witnessed how complex this question was for participants, I wanted to complicate influential media caricatures of Chinese students' blind nationalism, which have, as I said, got much worse in the context of our deteriorating bilateral relations with China in the hands of our glorious leaders in the coalition government in Australia over these years. So I delineate two key logics that I found are really central to these students' national structure of feeling. First, and this is a bit of a mouthful, but I'll explain it, a performative ethics of national representation, which essentially means the importance of making the right type of statements about China in the right context to the right audience when you are yourself a Chinese student abroad. Situationally, one needs to make specific kinds of remarks in specific situations. It's a particular kind of burden of representation, if you like. So an example I use there in the book is that of Yang Shuping, who became notorious in her commencement speech at the University of Maryland in 2017, when she spoke about how she loved being in the United States because of what she called the fresh air of democratic freedom, was such a contrast to her characterization of her life in China, where there was not only physical smog in the air, but also free speech was muffled or not allowed, like wearing a mask. And this became an absolute kind of catalyst for a new wave of outrage on the part of Chinese students. So we had a discussion about this in my group, and that's where this notion of the performative ethics of national representation came out, because what people were objecting to was that she said the things she did on that platform at that time in such an important event that would embarrass all of her classmates from China and bring shame to them. Doesn't mean you can't criticize pollution or lack of free speech, just don't do it in that situation. Okay, so this is, hence I call it, it's a performative kind of logic of when to say what and what effect that will have. The other kind of key logic is what I call a developmentalist narrative of nationhood, a kind of hypersensitivity to backwardness versus advancement, the backwater versus the front runner. Is the image of China as a sort of, one of my participants said, is it like a peasant who suddenly struck it rich and, wears terrible clothing combinations and is crude and crass? Or is it a wonderful, sophisticated cosmopolitan lady on the world stage? Are we backward or are we advanced? That kind of developmentalist logic. This national structure of feeling does have a strongly gendered dimension. I mean, in the sort of metaphor I just used, both of those figures were female, the auntie and the cosmopolitan lady. There's another one which I really love this. It's an allegory that was related to me by a young scholar here, Andy Zhao, Xinyu, who said, imagine if you're out at an event with your mother and some random stranger comes up to you and said, your mother's dress is so ugly, right? Now, what are you going to do? I mean, regardless of what you think about what your mother is wearing, you pretty much have to argue with that stranger, right? You pretty much have to defend your mother's honor, because that stranger is embarrassing you and everyone in your family by drawing attention to that dress. No matter what, maybe it is an ugly dress, but you can't say that there, right? So it's this gendered metaphor of the nation as a maternal figure, as a motherland, in fact. So that's the kind of the key gendered aspect of that stuff on nationalism. The final thing that I do with the question of nationalism and patriotism is to explore how participants' orientations towards China during their years abroad shifted a little, in particular in three ways: an increasing tendency to separate the concept of the nation from the concept of the government. So the dawning awareness that one could be loyal to the people of China, to the culture of China, but doesn't mean you love the government, much as, this same thing with any nation. Second, access to diverse media, leading to greater reflexivity in students' views on China, both as a result of seeing different media content, but also as a result of thinking we can have a polyvocal media sphere rather than just one. And particularly going back home and seeing this, the tightening media environment in China during the years they were away, when things became there was much more propaganda, say on the nightly news, than there was a couple of years earlier. So being outside that environment, then going back, leads to a kind of denaturalization effect. And thirdly, a growing appreciation of the multiplicity of Chinese identity, you know, making friends from Taiwan or Hong Kong or the diaspora causes students to think, I used to think Chinese identity was one thing, but perhaps it's more than one thing, which in turn, you know, leads to a kind of complication of some of those earlier ways of thinking.
So, Fran, I think we need to save some time for a few questions from the audience. So, why don't I just conclude with something that I think is already on everyone's minds, as it is on ours too. You say towards the end of your book, uh, will mobility reassert itself as our era's cultural dominant? Is neoliberal globalization experiencing a crisis that will fundamentally reshape the world we know? Does this book provide a snapshot of a lost past or an insight into forms of being that will return as a defining feature of future times? So I read this question as saying the following. I read the book itself as a book written at the cusp of a momentous change in how and where we travel and for what. So would you like to comment on this question of higher education driven transnational mobility in this semi post COVID era and speculate a little more about its futures or its replacements?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think this is a question that we'd all love to be able to answer, and I can't answer it any better than anyone else. But it does. Your question does touch on a really key point in the book, which became more and more sharply apparent as the project progressed. That is the ultimately questionable sustainability of Australian universities and governments' neoliberal transformation of higher education into an export commodity. I guess the dramatic increase in COVID has just brought this home very, very clearly to us. The dramatic increases over the past 2 decades in the outflow of students from China and the inflow of international students to Australia results from the commercialization of education in both countries. Rising numbers of Chinese students going abroad are linked with an understanding among the middle classes there that a privately funded overseas degree is an educational commodity that facilitates the accumulation of cultural and mobility capitals. In the case of Australia, the development of education is what is widely characterised as an export industry, and our politicians really use that completely unreflexively, education alongside, you know, oil, gold and coal as an export commodity. This results, let's call it what it is, from declining government funding for universities, which are national universities. By 2017, international fee income accounted for over 23% of Australian public universities' revenue, making it their single largest non-government revenue source. And Australia is widely recognised, and I'm quoting here from some scholars, Brooks and Waters, as having the most organised and aggressive international recruitment and marketing strategy for its universities in the world. And it's the third largest destination country for international students after the United States and the UK at present. So the questionable sustainability of this situation is brought home to all of us, especially strongly right now. Look what happens when we take these students away. Our national economy loses billions in income and our sector is thrown into crisis. And that's only on the economic side. More importantly, I hope this book also sheds some much needed light on the questionable social sustainability of current practices in Australia's so-called education export as well. That throws up really big kind of soul-searching questions for the future of higher education. And I've tried to kind of think about that a little bit more in a different thing that I've also brought out, a policy report called The Road to Recovery, which I can give people the link to that if they're interested, just about that big question of the social sustainability of the sector and what are we going to do from here. I hope that more heed might be paid from now on to the welfare and well-being needs of these students. Not that it's not paid, there's hundreds of people trying to do their best to see to these students' well-being while they're here, but it's not enough. We need more investment in that if this is to be a socially sustainable project. And I'm hoping that perhaps the COVID crisis, now that we see what we can miss out on if this goes away, you know, might help us to invest a little bit more in those areas. So that's a quick response to a very big question. I want to get to the question and answer, and let's do that. And we'll look at the chat. Maybe Teju, if you could help in a moment by picking out questions from the chat, that'd be great. But we'll also ask people to speak. Before we do that, I just very quickly would like to say a few thanks at this point. Particularly, again, this is about the third time I've mentioned it, but I'm just so eternally grateful to the Australian Research Council for funding this research, to the University of Melbourne also for their further support, both sort of infrastructural and financial. They kicked in a nice chunk of money, which was very much appreciated. To the Inter-Asia Cultural Studies Society for supporting this launch, especially to Annika and Jimin for the fantastic poster. To the Centre for Inter-Asian Research at Ahmedabad University, which also supported this launch, the centre which of course Professor Niranjana heads, as I said earlier. To the scores of people in the international education industry across Australia and China who assisted with the primary research. There is like about 3 pages of names in the book. I won't read them all, but they know who they are. To the colleagues in cultural studies and at the School of Culture and Communication as well at the University of Melbourne, who always provide a supportive and inspiring environment in which to work. And to all of the primary research participants, again, they know who they are. I'm not going to name them, of course, because of anonymity, but I've known these young women, some of them since 2011, some of them more recently, but many years of both of our lives. As I said before, it's been life-changing for me as well as I think for some of them. So I can't express enough my thanks to them. And finally, thanks to my family, Mum and Dad are here today, lurking there, and to Peter and Tom, who are out there in the house somewhere. They might pop in a moment, but I couldn't have done all of this without the family support, which is really the bedrock of everything else. So thanks, everyone.